It's a pleasure to be here. I really am very pleased to be in this institute precisely because of its history. So what I will tell you about is first the beginnings that Mark just described, and then some thoughts about the future. And the thoughts about the future will involve nothing more complicated than arithmetic. It will be interesting to hear a reaction to some of that arithmetic. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the beginnings, the root cause of how things got started, then the experiment itself, very briefly. And then I am going to take a pretty hard look at whether it makes sense to think about nuclear power as a way of actually decarbonizing the energy sector. And there's some key questions that you have to ask. First of all, what are the constraints on construction and costs? What about safety? What about security? What about waste disposal? And what about public perception? And at the end, I'll give you my take on whether or not nuclear power can play a significant role in addressing the impacts of climate change. So that's the plan. So two anniversaries passed. You just heard about the crucial date, December 2nd. So at 3:25 p.m., after a failed start in the morning, the pile, and there's a picture of that pile here. Here's the pile, and there is the group of physicists and others who participated in building the pile at the crucial time, at 3:25 p.m. And this is the 75th anniversary. And one of the issues that we were confronted is what exactly to call this event. You couldn't quite call it a celebration because there are too many negatives associated with nuclear power. So we decided to call it a commemoration. That's what it is. And it turns out that the same day, same date, December 2nd, turns out to be also the date on which the sculpture that sits on top of the place where that experiment took place is today located. The installation of Henry Moore's sculpture called Nuclear Energy. It was 25 years later after the event, and this happens to be there for the 50th anniversary of that installation. By the way, and I should say that that is Stagg Field, and it turns out that there's some interesting photos of the interior of Stagg Field. I knew that that football had ceased to exist as a major collegiate sport at Chicago during the late 30s because of our president then, who said something like, this is an approximation, so a historian may want to correct me, that whenever the urge to exercise came to him, he lay down until the urge went away. So it was perfectly in tune with getting rid of football as a collegiate sport. And so the photographs on the inside, I wish I had included it, showed some weeds and very large bushes growing right next to the stands. Clearly, this was a stadium due to be basically disassembled, torn down. And so just in time, here it was available for this experiment. So the proximate cause, I don't expect you to, this is not an eye chart. This is basically a scan of the letter that led to the beginning of the Manhattan Project. It was a letter that had Albert Einstein's signature, but not his authorship. He didn't write it. It was written by Gillet, who had, so it's complicated history. Different people attribute different authorship to this. Edward Teller was supposed to have participated, perhaps. Van Neumann may have participated in the writing of this letter. So a bunch of distinguished physicists who were concerned about what was going on in Germany. One of the key things that happened in Germany was that the Germans had stopped export of uranium from Czechoslovakia, a sign that they considered it a strategic good. And that was, of course, somewhat worrisome. The experimental discovery of fission had been done in 1938 by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, and what is interesting, of course, the story about Chicago is that Fermi, in Fermi's group, when he was still in Rome, had done basically the same experiment as Hahn had done, except that he had installed some blockages, so basically some filters, physical filters, that so that he failed to see the daughter products of the fission event. Amazing. So he could have been the discoverer of fission, and he just missed it because he had blocked the, he didn't see the barium, for example. Amazing. Anyway, so this is the letter that started it all, August 2nd, 1939. Here's the pile. I think you can see it, the 10th layer in construction. It's interesting that there are no photographs of the pile when it was completed. There are just some photographs of the process as it was being constructed. This is one of the photographs. All there is are just hand drawings of the pile, and there you see it. And you can see that it just fit into this room, which was the swashboard. What's amazing about it is how long it took to build, 15 days. The people that built it were, you love this, graduate students and postdocs, and some kids from the neighborhood who were brawny and didn't have a problem in lifting 20-pound blocks of graphite. And if you've ever dealt with graphite, it's kind of a messy stuff. If it gets on you, it's kind of greasy. And so it wasn't pleasant stuff to work with. And also, you can notice that some of it had to be drilled, and because that's where uranium was put. So how much stuff was there? So 360 tons of graphite, 45 tons of uranium oxide, 6 tons of uranium metal, all that stuff put together in 24/7 in two 12-hour shifts. They worked very hard. It was amazing how fast this was done. There's a crucial word in there, purified graphite. You might wonder why that's there. And it turns out that the graphite that was available commercially had a problem because it had contaminations, and the contamination turned out to be a fantastic absorber of neutrons. So if you didn't know that the graphite was contaminated and you use that for a pile, you get the wrong answer for things like what the cross-sections are. You, in particular, make a very large mistake about what the critical mass had to be for a bomb. And it turns out the Germans had never figured it out. They didn't realize this mistake. It's kind of surprising because Heisenberg was no dummy. But it turns out that Fermi and his folks realized it, and so they insisted on a different kind of graphite that had to be purified. Okay, so so I mentioned that there was a moderator. Why is there a moderator? So there are two issues here. So first of all, it turns out that if you ask about the interaction cross-section for neutrons with the stuff, the target, which is U-235, here's a graph that, of course, this was not known to Fermi. This is a recent calculation. But what you can see is that the lower the energy of the neutron, the larger the cross-section. The same thing is true, by the way, for plutonium. So, the neutrons that come out of the fission event turn out to be about an MeV, and the ones that are optimum in the reactor turn out to be about an EV, and here's 10 to the minus 6. So this is the sweet spot where they wanted to be, and so you needed something to slow the neutrons down. Turns out either water or graphite will do it. They use graphite. That's why graphite is here. And here's a little bit of physics. Sorry about this for some of you, but here's the idea. So the idea that the neutron splits the uranium atom, the U-235, is incorrect. The reason why the neutron has to be slow, a thermal neutron, is because what it does is it's absorbed by the U-235 nucleus. And so it turns U-235 into U-236, and not just into U-236, a different isotope, but also an excited state of U-236. And that excited state turns out to have an extremely short lifetime. it is the one that fissions. So what you're seeing here is this is the compound nucleus. The crucial point is that it's not spherical. And if you think back on your nuclear theory, those of you remember your nuclear physics course, the water bag model, right? The more deformed the nucleus from a sphere is, the more the electrostatic repulsion of the protons overcomes the strong force. So that's basically, that's the bottom line physics here, that the electrostatic repulsion overcomes, this thing flies apart. And in this case, what you get is dual nuclei barium. In krypton, there turn out to be, this is just one of the channels. One of the things that's always puzzling to people is how can it be that the result is 2.4 neutrons per fission event? Do neutrons come in fractional bits? They don't. But what you do have is different channels. This happens to be the krypton barium channel with these particular isotopes. Here's another channel with a different isotope of barium and krypton. And here's a third channel, zirconium and tellurium. So it turns out there are always two daughter products, and which one it is just a probabilistic event. Okay. And so out comes energy in the form of gamma rays and the neutrons. The neutrons, those neutrons have to be slowed down in order to then continue the chain reaction. Okay. So here is, I have to show you, this is the graph of the result. This is the strip chart that was actually recorded. And what you see there is as they withdrew control rods, they pulled them out. You can see the increase in neutrons. So this is just a neutron. So they readjusted the scale. And then here finally, this is it. Here's the big event. Here's the big event where they got the chain reaction. And then shortly thereafter, they shut things down. So here's what happened. So the neutron multiplication factor was slightly over 1. You want a reactor, not a bomb. That's important. Very useful to do that. And just to explain a little bit further, so the supercriticality comes from the fact that there are two kinds of neutrons as a result of the fission event. There are the prompt neutrons that come out when the U-236 splits, and then there are neutrons that come out, they're delayed by about 14 seconds, that come out because the daughter products are neutron emitters. So that fraction is about slightly less than 1%, and they're the ones that make this the reaction go critical, supercritical. Okay? So just slightly supercritical. So it ran, the original ran for about 4.5 minutes, half a watt, which is about, I think it will light a night light maybe. And then they decided to do some more experiments. Eventually it reached 200 watts. And then a few months later, it was disassembled. And it was the first, no, we didn't go back in time, sorry. 1942. My finger missed the 9, got a 0. Sorry about that.
1943,
yes, I made 2 mistakes, right. It was 44. Thank you for that. Right. It was later. It was moved to something that they called Site A at that time, which is not actually on the argon property today. It's actually just slightly off-site, in fact, just east of Cass Avenue, those of you know argon. And it was rebuilt to build the next reactor, CP2. So here's some of the signatures of people who are still around at the 40th anniversary, and there's a picture after the end of the war, the 4th anniversary, and here, of course, is the great man himself, Enrico Fermi. So if you look at the people who are there, it's kind of an amazing number of famous people. Here's Gillard, the fellow that got Einstein and that's him right here. He's the one who got Einstein to write that letter, or sign the letter. Yeah. So here's the sculpture that I was talking about before, and this is one of, in 65, This is what Henry Moore said about that sculpture. As a general principle, I prefer to let the work speak for itself, but sometimes it's possible to give a hint of what is in one's mind in making the sculpture. In this, the upper part is very much connected with the mushroom cloud of an atomic explosion, but also it has the shape and eye socket of a skull. Okay. Here's another version, some 7 years later. One might think of the lower part as being the protective form constructed for human beings, and the top being more like the destructive side of the atom. So in between the two, it might express to people in a symbolic way the whole event. I think that's a different explanation. And then the last thing on the right is a letter that Chandrasekhar wrote to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I found this in the archives of the Bulletin. He was correcting somebody who had given actually this explanation. He said, well, that's not what Henry Moore said to me. So I have a copy of this, and basically, I mean, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's a very different. So there are three versions. Chandra, those of you who have met Chandra, know about Chandra, know that he had a remarkably photographic, and if there's something like photographic memory for oral, for hearing, he remembered everything accurately. And so whatever he says that Henry Moore said here, Henry Moore said. So you have three versions of Henry Moore. So I think it's fair to say the first thing that Henry Moore said is probably correct. As a general principle, I prefer to let my work speak it for itself. I think that's probably the end of the story. Okay. So we've harvested the consequences of that experiment. We've lived through this, through the atomic age, when in the beginning when the atom is your friend. And some people might have changed their mind about this. So now the question is, so what about today? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a series of calculations, then some issues. So the first question is, so if you're going to use nuclear energy to affect climate change, presumably what you want to do is decarbonize the energy sector. So the obvious question is, so what would it take to do that? And the different metrics, you could, for example, use a power metric where somebody tells you, this is how many gigawatts or terawatts I have to deal with, and I have to now replace them. Or, for example, I could say, what would it take to replace all coal planets on this Earth? Or you could use an output metric. So you can say, we know how much CO2 is being emitted, and I want to eliminate so many gigatons of CO2 emission per year by some date certain, say 2050, whatever it is. So we'll look at both of that. And then the question is, how fast can you build? You ask yourself, so what are the key constraints on how rapidly, how many plants per year you can build? I'll talk about that. How expensive is it going to be? And then there are all these other issues that I mentioned at the beginning: safety, security, waste disposal, public perception. And then number 5, I'll give you my opinion, and it will be interesting to hear your reaction. Okay, so before we go any further, here are a couple of things I want to say. The first thing is to say, just up front, that whatever we want in the United States may not matter very much to anybody else. That's an important thing to say, especially in light of the present administration, okay? So I just want to say that up front. It is the case that there is a burst of nuclear power plant construction, both by what I'll call the nuclear states, so China, India, South Korea, Russia, but also what we'll call the nuclear newcomers. Abu Dhabi, I was at the site in Abu Dhabi, where 4 plants are being built by the South Koreans. Iran, of course, Turkey, Vietnam. Actually, there's a quite long list of wannabes and people who are actually building this going on. And we can talk, if you're interested at the end, we could talk about all these various issues, exactly what's involved there. The motivations for building, I think, are complicated. For some, energy security, that's what I heard. I think India is a major factor. In some areas, for example, in Abu Dhabi, it's power for desalination. They need water. National pride. Preparing for potential breakout. That, of course, is what some of us in the States fear and in Europe fear is going on in Iran. Maybe. Maybe. The builders and operators are very different from what we've experienced in the States. They're typically either public or public-private joint ventures, but what is usually the case is that these things are going on in markets that are very heavily regulated. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. One of the consequences is that the end user, the person who pays the money, you and me, who pay for the electricity, may not actually pay for the real costs. And so if your consumer is isolated from the real costs, then the political calculations about whether or not it makes sense to build these things is very different. In the United States, for example, where the markets are deregulated, in states where the markets are deregulated, nuclear power, just to tell you in advance, is basically a dead issue. You cannot build a nuclear power plant in the United States in those states in which the electricity markets are deregulated, because the nuclear power plants cannot compete on price with combined cycle natural gas-fired plants. It just economically makes no sense. And then, of course, the political issues are different and are probably dealt differently in different places. In some places, there's no public opposition. I visited North Vietnam, for example, last year, and to say that I think it's fair to say that civil society, in the sense that you have it, for example, here in India, simply does not exist in Vietnam. Right? So to say that there's no opposition is not exactly portraying things accurately. Okay, so just to give you an idea, a numerical idea of what's going on, these are numbers I got from the IEA database. So this is about a year old, but it gives you, I don't think things have changed in a year. So China's in the lead. They have 36 operating reactors. Other than the United States, we have more, but we're hardly building anything. So so last year, October, we were building 4 in the United States. Right now, we're not building any because the construction in South Carolina, Georgia are a standstill. The South Carolina reactors have been they're dead issue. They're not going to be built. And Georgia is going to decide sometime this year, so within the next few weeks, whether to proceed. So that number could well go to 0. China has 20 under construction, India 5, Japan 2. So you can see, about 60 plants, of order 60 plants are under construction. And it suggests that people are interested. So, yes, please.
What fraction of, would you remember, what fraction of Taiwan's electricity comes from nuclear?
It's a pretty large fraction. So they have 6 sites where nuclear power is being produced, and it's probably of the order of 30%, something like that. Yeah.
Which among these countries are the largest fraction?
Of the ones that are building,
Yeah.
United States. Yeah. Of the largest fraction of people not building, it's France. And Sweden. Sweden, in terms of proportion, probably has the largest proportion of its power being provided by nuclear power, about 50%. And it's the only country in which absolutely no hydrocarbons are being used to produce energy. The other 50% is hydro. So they have, I'm sorry? Yes. Sir?
As far as I know, Japan only 5 nuclear power plant is operational in the moment.
Well, so Japan is complicated, right? To say the least.
Other countries, all are operational or like that also many are off. Even though the reactor is there, shut down. But it is shut down or they are not producing any power.
So it's complicated. Yeah, so let's go back to the slide. So operational, so the IEA database did not distinguish between plants that are operating, producing electricity, and plants that could be operating had the authorities allowed to operate it. So that number that says there 43 means that these are plants that are capable of producing electricity. But certainly, as you know, I think that's the point of your question, at the time, there were definitely not 43 operating reactors. That's correct. I think if you were to talk to the Japanese Nuclear Energy Authority, their plan is to just wait out the public opposition and to turn all those reactors back on. Maybe with the, well, I think even the reactors that are the old GE design, because there's another site north of Fukushima, about 50 kilometers north of Fukushima, also on the coast, that has exactly the same reactors as the ones that were destroyed in Fukushima, Daiichi. So anyway, okay. So here's what needs to be replaced. And I'm just going to pick an arbitrary date. I mean, we can do the calculation. As I said, this is just arithmetic, right? So if you like, if you want to choose 2100, we can do that. But I just chose as a target 2050. And the generating capacity that we have to deal with total is almost 7 terawatts, okay? Of which 40% is provided by coal. And a very crucial number that one has to keep in mind whenever you see these numbers is the difference between capacity and capacity factor. This is a very important one because that befuddles the issue constantly if you don't distinguish between those two. So generating capacity means it's the nameplate. If this thing were operating 24/7 constantly on, that's what a plant. So a gigawatt reactor, for example, produces 1 gigawatt. Okay. Now you have to ask, does it really run 24/7, 365 days a year? No, it does not. So when you take into account that it has to be refueled, maintenance, and all that, in the United States, the capacity factor for nuclear power plants is slightly over 90%. So something over 10% is out of action. Okay? Coal plants turn out to be, here's an amazing fact, the capacity factor from the EIA data is 40%. 60% of the time they're not producing power. Think about that, okay? So that is something to keep in mind when you're comparing different technologies. In the US, if you look at the capacity factor, for example, solar, it's under 30%. Okay? So somebody tells you they've installed 1 terawatt capacity of solar, they haven't installed, they're not producing 1 terawatt, okay? They're producing 300 megawatts. Okay, so if you take all this into account, by the way, nuclear is about 5% of capacity, 10% of the actual production. What's the difference between those two numbers? Well, the difference is the capacity factor. Okay? Nuclear, by the way, it's interesting, in the United States has reached now, in 2015, and it's been holding steady, almost 93%. Worldwide, it's less. It's about 81%. What's interesting is if you go back historically, in the late 70s, early 80s, the capacity factor for nuclear was more like between 60 and 70%. You'd ask yourself, what happened? What happened is people got the point of if something is working, it's making money. If it's not working, it's not making money. So preventive maintenance and being surveillance makes a big difference. That is the reason that these plants are operating. Their capacity factor is very high. Okay, so what do you need to replace? Well, when you do the arithmetic, it turns out you need about 1.3 gigawatts of nuclear to replace all the existing coal plants. And oh, by the way, you also need to replace all of those existing nuclear power plants that will no longer be producing power by 2050, because the typical lifetime of these plants is somewhere between 40 and 60 years, and they're going to be gone by then. So you have to do two things. You have to replace the coal plants, and you have to replace the operating plants today. Okay? And that assumes no growth in demand, which is, well, as I said, we're full of assumptions. Now, here's another way of doing the calculations. And this is a way of thinking that goes back to Sokolov at Princeton. Bob Sokolov introduced these wedges. The idea is each wedge corresponds to removing from the output of power plants into the atmosphere 1 gigaton of carbon per year by 2054. That was his original wedge, and then they revised it. and the wedge was then redefined to be 4 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050. So you pick your favorite technology, and you design each technology at a scale so that it will remove 4 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year by that date, the nominal date that we're talking about. So to cap CO2 emissions, to basically to eliminate what we're putting into the atmosphere today, will require 8 new wedges. And the obvious question is, can nuclear do 8 wedges? I'm going to answer that question, okay? It will be my answer, and then we can argue about it. So when I go through the arithmetic, it turns out one wedge, one of the Sakharov revised wedges, is about 1.5 terawatts nuclear. Okay? That's what you have to build. Okay.
What's the argument for 8 wedges?
So you just add up 4 gigatons of carbon CO2 per year. That's each wedge. So 8 times, so it's 32 gigatons of would level out, would basically prevent, according to them, what it would have done, it would have kept us below 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Of course, we've blown past that already, okay? But never mind that. So I'm just I'm making the argument in terms of the Sokolov original argument, okay, to keep the CO2 content in the atmosphere below 400 parts per million, okay? So the question is, so how fast can you build? So what I'm going to do is look at the period when there were no constraints, basically no constraints on reactor building, and look at the fastest that reactors were being built in the past. Okay? So in this period between 1960 and 1980, the 222 reactors were put in service. Between 70 and 80, 139. And roughly speaking, so about 14 reactors on average were new starts every year. Okay? Now it turns out that modern reactors are actually better, in quotes, in 2 respects. Number one, they have larger production capacity. So the Gen 3 plus reactors, like the European, the Areva EPR, or the AP1000, or the Korean version of the AP1000, the APR 1400, the nameplate capacity somewhere between a gigawatt electric to 1.4 gigawatts electric. And the average Gen 2 capacity factor worldwide today is 80%, but surely at this point, folks will know, you hope, that if you run a Gen 3 plus reactor, that you can get up to the current US value, so 93%. Okay? So I'm going to assume that, to be optimistic, I'm going to assume a capacity factor of 93%, and I'm going to assume larger reactors. Remember that many of the reactors that were being put online during this heyday of nuclear were more like 500, 600 megawatts electric, so quite a bit smaller. And I should also say that one limiting factor, which I'm going to ignore, but is an issue, is the capacity for making very large forgings. These are the forgings necessary to make the pressure vessel for the reactors. Today, it's amazing, the United States has lost the ability to make forgings of that size. We can no longer make such forgings in the United States today. So if they're going to be made, they're going to be made either in Japan, or South Korea, or here in India. That's it. Okay, so how expensive would it be? So just to give you a sense of numbers, so these are numbers that come from the Department of Energy in the United States. This data that goes back just a couple of years. And I think basically, I don't think there, I couldn't argue that there are any changes since 2015, 2016. And the one exception on this table is the offshore wind data, and that comes from Denmark, where they actually have quite a bit of experience. So if you look at the typical, if you look at the size of things that you could build, these are the typical installations. Why is it 2.234 where does that number come from? It's that in most cases, certainly in the United States, typically in a given generating site, there will be 2 reactors sited. If you look at any of the sites that were built in the United States in the 1980s, there were always at least 2 reactors on a site. Okay, so this is per site. If you look at what's called the overnight cost. Overnight cost means I don't account for the financing costs. It's very important. Okay, nuclear does not look great. The only thing that's worse is offshore wind. You can see the problem with why land-based wind and advanced combined cycle plants with natural gas are such a threat for nuclear. And look at the capacity factors. Okay? And it's very hard to see how you can change the capacity factors for wind and solar. The one exception I know of is I recently have done some work in Chile. In Chile, if you put a solar plant in the Atacama, the capacity factor is more like 40%. And what's the difference? There are no clouds. It's one of the few places on this planet where there is no rain ever. It's just completely dry. And since it's closer to the equator, night and day times are not that different. Right? That's a very interesting place. Okay. Yes, sorry.
Why tidal power is not included?
What is that called?
Tidal.
Oh, tidal. That will... I'll give you an opinion. It's based on an opinion of mine, which is that it is very unlikely that tidal will ever be a major factor like the technologies that are up here. It's very hard to see how that is. If you look at tidal installations that exist, they do exist, okay? They tend to have very high maintenance costs compared to these technologies. I mean, it is very hard to beat natural gas combined cycle. Very hard. The technology is extremely mature. The maintenance costs are relatively low. And the efficiency of a modern combined cycle plant is somewhere around 60–70%. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable how good. Unfortunately, you use fossil fuel. What can you say? But it's it's a technology to beat. And in the end, keep in mind that typically, not always, but typically, certainly in the United States, utilities are economic beings, and they're simply not going to invest in technologies where they can't make money. That's it. So that's certainly in the United States. That's what we're facing. You may have other constraints such as energy security, which can in fact beat the argument of economics, but there are not many other arguments that can beat that. Okay. So how fast can you build? So I basically told you what the key limiting factor is. I'm going to simply assume that when countries decide they're going to build, when Japan, Russia, maybe the United States, I doubt it quite frankly, but India, when you decide to really go whole hog into nuclear, you will build the capacity for large forgings. It will just come. It's not for free, but we know that we can do this. It's been done before, right? Okay, oops, sorry, I went the wrong way here. Okay, so the numbers that I just showed you are deceptive in a very, very important way, and in a way that particularly matters for Europe and for the United States. Probably not for you, maybe, and we'll get to this. So there are two factors. The first factor is whether or not those numbers make any sense for nuclear depends hugely on the vendor. So consider Areva for example, in France. So Areva is building, was building 3 plants, 2 in Finland, 1 in France. In both cases, they used local workforce to build. You can ask, when was the last time that Areva, the company, built a nuclear power plant? And the answer is, can you tell me? When's the last time Areva, as a company, built a nuclear power plant? Never. is the answer. Never. They've never built a power plant. Framatome, which is the predecessor of Areva, had built one back in the 80s. So now you're talking about almost 30 years gap of when the predecessor of the existing company built a power plant. Guess how many engineers, technical people are left from that period to actually build a power plant? Not many. So what it means is that you have a company that's going to build a gigawatt plant, a new design. It was an EPR design with a workforce that had never been there before, had never done this before. So are you shocked to learn that the cost overrun was a factor of 2 in Finland? A factor of 2. So what did Finland do? It said, thank you very much. We're canceling one of the plants, finish the one that you've been working on. What about the one in France? Well, same cost overrun, almost exactly the same, but the French are going to finish it. By the way, Westinghouse, in the essays, I didn't write this here, but Westinghouse had exactly the same issue. 4 plants, 2 in South Carolina, 2 in Georgia. Huge cost overruns. You can ask, when is the last time Westinghouse, the company, built a nuclear power plant? The answer is the same, in the 80s. How many engineers do they have today to do this? 0. Westinghouse actually is no longer owned, is not an American company. Majority ownership is Toshiba. Does Toshiba have people? Yes. So now here's a different kind of question to ask you. What do you think the American reaction would be if Toshiba Westinghouse had brought in a Japanese workforce to build the plants in Georgia and South Carolina? Okay, you have your answer. Okay. So this is the reason that there's only maybe 2 plants going to be built and probably none. I think it's very likely that Georgia will, the Public Utility Commission in Georgia will say no, and it will be the end of that. The contrast is with KEPCO. KEPCO is, of course, the South Korean company. Well, company. It's a quasi-governmental entity. I don't know what else to call it. Entity. They have been building power plants. The 4 plants that are being built in the Emirates, in Abu Dhabi, you go there, I've been there, and next to the site is a very large town, and it's peopled by South Koreans. They're building the plant. The Emirates, as you can imagine, don't have people that are capable of building a power plant. So the KEPCO brought the people to build a power plant from their company in Korea. They're building it. And guess what? On budget, on time. So what it tells you is whether or not the costs that I showed you earlier make any sense depends on whether the company that's going to rebuild it has actually been in this business or not. And if they haven't been in this business, those numbers are just pure fiction. So in the United States, one of the reasons it's probably not going to happen is because the only company in the United States, the only companies, plural actually, that are in the business of today building nuclear power plants are companies that are not building commercial power plants, nuclear power plants, they're building naval reactors. And they're not used to building gigawatt scale plants. They're used to building plants that are more like 100 megawatts or less. SMR, small modular reactors. Right? So that's the first thing to think about. The experience matters. And the second is that when you look at the numbers for wind or solar, what you have to keep in mind is that if you're going to depend on them, in the absence of extensive and proven storage, grid-level storage, you also have to have backup. And the backup is going to be something that is not renewable. Typically in the United States, it's gas-fired combined cycle plants. So what it means is that you're going to have backup, which has a nominal capacity factor that's pretty high. Natural gas power plants are actually quite efficient and have high capacity factors. But as backup, they don't have a large capacity factor. You might be using them maybe 20, 30% of the time. So that changes the economic picture because that power is going to be very expensive. You've built a power plant, it's capable of supplying a lot of electricity, but it's not being used very often because it's used as backup. It's very expensive electricity. So now if you fold that in, it turns out the renewables all of a sudden no longer look so attractive, and everything hinges on this, the answer to the question, will we have, by 2050, cost-effective grid-scale storage? And if we don't, the economics will not work out. Okay, so what have we not talked about? What will make a big difference? So these are three things I want to talk about. Safety. So, okay, so there are three really big accidents. There have been small accidents, but these are the ones that had all the public impact. They're rare, but hugely impactful. Only one of them caused serious health damage, and that, of course, was Chernobyl. In part, it was because the plants used graphite as a moderator. Graphite has the embarrassing property that graphite burns. It's coal. Version of coal, right? It's carbon. And it was the burning graphite that lifted the radionuclides high in the atmosphere and caused it to spread. That was the problem. It's interesting that if you go back and ask why the accidents happened, they happened because of, number one, design flaws, number two, regulatory failure, and three, operator failure. So it's a perfect storm in every one of these cases. And it's kind of fun if you want to know details, but what happened, for example, Fukushima, I happen to know quite a bit about Fukushima, and it's a perfect example of those three issues. So could you get around this? And I think the answer is yes. First of all, you can build power plants today, and all the new designs have this feature that they do not fail in a total station blackout, like what happened in Fukushima Daiichi. So I just will tell you up front that lessons learned here don't work very well. Because if you start with Chernobyl, go to 3 Mile Island, go to Fukushima Daiichi, each one had a different failure. So if you had incorporated all the lessons learned from Chernobyl, they wouldn't have helped you with 3 Mile Island. Lessons learned at 3 Mile Island wouldn't have helped you with Fukushima Daiichi. So there are always things that we learn because something goes wrong that I didn't know about. So just keep that in mind, okay? But it's certainly arguable that the modern designs really get around all the design flaws that these early designs have. My feeling is that the most important thing is to have an independent regulator who has the ability to enforce their decisions. This is exactly what the problem was in Japan, and interestingly enough, in the United States for 3 Mile Island, the regulator was tied, in both cases, to the promoter of nuclear energy. In the case of the United States, the regulator, the NRC, used to be part of the Department of Energy. So there's a bit of an uncomfortable fit. You have people that try to regulate, but they were part of the same bureaucracy, the people that are trying to say nuclear is great. So you have to have an independent regulator. I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was in Turkey 2.5 years ago, and Turkey was considering an offer by the Russians to build, operate, and own, so what's called the BOO model, B-O-O model, nuclear power plants right on the Black Sea, and would solve a number of problems. The Turks would only have to pay for the electricity, wouldn't have to pay any upfront capital construction costs, and because the Russians would operate, own this plant, the Turks also wouldn't have a spent fuel problem because the Russians would supply the fuel and also take it back home. Sounds great. So I asked the regulator, do you have the power to issue a stop work order to the Russians? Well, that's interesting. And it turns out the Russians consider the power plant sovereign territory. Now, let's see, would you want to have them operate a power plant on your territory? Maybe not. That's something to think about. Okay, so I think having somebody who pays attention to the safety issues, security issues, and has the power to enforce what they say is hugely important. And there are countries where you might wonder whether it's possible to have an independent regulator. I'm thinking, for example, of Vietnam. Okay? India, I think, for example, where bureaucracies are known to fight one another. I think if you have a regulator here, you know they'll go to bat. So you're lucky that way. And I should also say one thing, lesson for all those things is, if you're going to want the public to trust what you do, please don't up front look like you're failing. If you lose trust in the beginning, to rebuild it is hugely difficult. I would argue almost impossible, very hard to do. Okay, security. So here's a grid from the power station. This is what basically the essence of a grid. Here's a generating station. Here's a transformer, takes out to high voltage. The big transmission lines go up to high voltages. Actually, today you can even go to not just AC but DC, say a million volts. Then you have the step-down transformers, go down in the United States down to 24 kilovolts, and you go to power, to companies, firms, and then you and me in the United States, 120 and 240 volts. Okay. So the obvious question is, are you a bad person? They're going to attack you. What do you think they're going to attack? I argue that it's very unlikely they're going to attack this. Why is this? If you've ever been in a nuclear power plant, it's basically a gigantic monster made of concrete. And to attack it is very difficult. Also, there are guards there. Where are there people or there are no people? I'll give you two places. Right here and right here. And the reason I'm showing you this is because this is a picture of a substation. Turns out there's a substation that provides the power for most of Silicon Valley. It's just outside of San Diego. And 3 years ago, a group of people got some high-powered rifles, and what they shot at was not the transformer, but they shot at this. So what is that? That's an oil tank. It's the tank, mineral oil, that cools the transformer. And if the transformer loses all that cooling, basically you have a meltdown in the transformer. Take a guess, how many of these kind of transformers are in storage so that if this goes out, you can just call up whoever, Siemens, come deliver me another one. What do you think the odds are? It's 0. Typically, you have to order them in advance. The build time for these is several months. So think of what could have happened if some smart person, some smart cop, had not noticed the oil dripping from here. Okay? San Diego, that whole area of the southern part of the Bay Area being out of power for 3 to 4 months. Wow. So that is an issue. You might think about this here, because you have substations here. I think Mumbai has at least one substation, and all it requires is a team with high-powered rifles, with silencers. Doesn't take much. That's something you worry about. Okay, so just to give you sleepless nights. Okay, so basically what I was saying here is, disabling the reactor is a non-starter. It doesn't really work. It was already tried, actually, in Belgium 3 years ago. It didn't work. What they reacted, by the way, what they targeted in the case of the Belgian attack was not the reactor itself, but they attacked what's called the balance of plant, which is the turbine building. And they basically caused a leak in the oil supply for the bearings of the turbine. So but the same story, right? You bring it to a halt. But there are also people that might want to gain access to radioactive materials. My feeling that going to a power plant to gain radioactive materials is also a fool's errand, because it's so much simpler to go to some hospitals, and there are Curie sources in some hospitals used for medical purposes. And guess how much guarding there is for those things. So if I were going to collect highly radioactive materials, I would not go to a power plant. I'd go to medical facilities, cancer research stations. Okay, waste management. This is a favorite topic of mine. So we know that nuclear waste is dangerous. You got to pay attention. Millennia, the way we do it, runs through. And we still do not have, after 60 plus years, still don't have a formal, agreed-upon, funded, functioning nuclear waste strategy. We don't have it. Amazing. We have 100 reactors, but we don't know what to do with the waste. The thing, unfortunately, is true just about every place else. Sweden and Finland are the exception, and Canada is also an exception. Canada was in the same pickle that we were in, but they had this thing called a Royal Commission that actually did something unusual for the United States, completely transparent, unfettered discussion. And in Canada, they turned things around. Canada now does have a strategy, and they're actually building a repository in Ontario. Amazing. We have a development commission. The development commission on the future of nuclear power was not unfair. They were told, whatever else you do, don't talk about Yucca Mountain. There we go. And on top of the other recommendations weren't followed anyway. Okay. Public perception. Little picture. This is straight from Walt Disney, Eisenhower's Atom for Peace initiative, and basically all of this, I would say, went south. Didn't work out well. There were technical weaknesses. There's a misunderstanding of what it means to regulate. This independence argument wasn't understood. There are these accidents. You can't get rid of this coupling. I mean, it's just there because it was there from the beginning. And then, of course, there were the signatories of the NPT. It's North Korea for sure, possibly Iran. It stopped. And then there were some who never signed the NPT, India, Israel, and Pakistan. And my claim is, I think it's just true. Transparency really does work if you are consistent in its application. And loss of trust is just deadly. And you can see from who succeeded and who has not. Okay, so I'm going to be super optimistic. I'm going to say everything works, forgings are not a problem, non-proliferation, all those things I just talked about, which I said were issues, I'm going to ignore them. What could you do? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to assume a build rate of 20 gigawatts per year, which is more than we built during the biggest build period after World War II. Right? We're going to ask yourself, what would you need to do to replace all the existing coal plants and all existing nuclear power plants? Remember, they're also dying by 2100, and if coal is going to be eliminated by 2050, what would be have to be the build rate? When you go through the numbers, again arithmetic, is you have to build at a pace of 40 gigawatts per year. So if you assume 20 gigawatts per year build rate and a capacity factor of, I say 93%, then it turns out you can reach one wedge in 80 years. So if you're going to assume that the target date is 2050, you'd have to, again, more than double that build rate. What are the odds that you can get up to 8 wedges? Not very likely. So what it tells you is that making the case that nuclear is the answer to all our problems is basically nonsense. So could nuclear do it all? It's clear. It's no by 2050 or 2100. We need 8 wedges. So here's the numbers, okay? If the target is 2050, the build rate would be 380 reactors per year. 2100, 150 reactors per year. And by the way, not to beat up on nuclear, any other technology you want to offer has the same issues. It's basically the same numbers. So what it tells you is we are stuck in a technological rut. And if you think back, there are interesting historical records about how fast you can change technologies in the energy sector. And typically, it takes 30, 40 years to make a dent. The transitions between, for example, wood and oil, those take long times. And the reason is because it's expensive. So I would say, here's my conclusion, it's going to take a mix, all hands on deck, so to speak, and it's going to be a long time before we can really argue that we'll be free of fossil-based fuel. Okay, that's it.